such a pleasure to see all of you here and to be in the wonderful city of Signal Hill. And it's a special treat for me because when Ken was first hired, he gave us, Steve Preston and me, a tour of the city and talked about the dreams and visions of the future. And so when I came back a year ago and Ken gave us the tour again, the reality's here, and it's just a thrill to have seen that and been part of it, and even from a distance from Pasadena. It's been a thrill. Anyhow, I'm Marcia Root, president of the Los Angeles Region Planning History Group, and this is our 11th colloquium, Black Gold in Paradise, the Influence of Oil and Energy Extraction on LA's Urban Form. And I gave this quiz to a couple of people here, but I dressed in the colors of the flyer. So I just wanted to give you all a heads up on that, just in case we have a break and I quiz you. First things first, it's my pleasure to introduce Larry Forrester, Mayor of Signal Hill, whose city obviously is hosting, and Mayor Forrester, I understand, is in his 4th term. His 5th term as mayor, and it's been a city council, and 4th term as mayor. Am I going to get it right? All right, anyhow. Thank you for being with us, and I'm going to quickly hand this over to you, and then I'll see you in just a moment.
It confuses people because here in Signal Hill we rotate mayor, and so I'm technically Larry Forrester, council member, currently serving as mayor. So that's the whole. But I want to welcome you all here. Marcia, thank you for the introduction, and I'd like to. Is this thing on? I'd like to welcome the Los Angeles Regional Planning History Group to Signal Hill. This is an exciting history program, and the city is pleased to participate in it. Let me do a brief introduction. First, I would like to introduce Larry Blendon. Larry, if you'd stand up and show yourself. Larry is our elected city treasurer, but more importantly, he's also president of our Signal Hill Historical Society. And all the work you see around here are really results of the Historical Society. And I want to thank Larry and his members for what they've done for the city. You've really done a great job and documented our fascinating past. Now our planning staff is here. Let me introduce them. Scott Charney. Is Scott here yet? Yes, Scott. Scott is our community development director. Colleen Doan is our associate planner. And Selena Lannis is our assistant planner. Now, they have a very interesting job, and their wealth of experiences work together to balance oil production and implement community improvement. You can build around oil wells, you can build around tank farms, and they've done a great, great job. I hope during breaks you'll stop and ask them questions of what they did and where we did it and how we did it. They're a wealth of knowledge. We also have representatives from Signal Hill Petroleum. Will they please stand up? Signal Hill Petroleum has been, I have to say, spectacular partners with the city. We've worked together on redevelopment of the oil fields and returning the surface to productive land uses. Housing, commercial centers, parks, and they continue with this development to still produce 1 million barrels of oil a year. So thank you. And they found a whole nother level of oil down at 10,000 feet. That's over 2 miles. Much of what you see today is how oil production started in 1920. You'll see all the pictures of the gushers. And how it impacted Southern California. We were caught in part of this heritage. In this area, we started the heritage of discovering oil. In fact, we became a city because of oil. When another city, we were unincorporated, another city said, oops, I'd like to have their production. But Long Beach didn't get it. So we became a city, and to answer a question that people often ask, Yes, we are the hole in the donut. Yes, we are surrounded 360 degrees by the city of Long Beach, and only one of 4 cities I know of in the United States as such. But what I must tell you, very importantly, is we have learned to peacefully coexist together. And I hope from talking with our experts today, you learn some of our experiences, what we've done, how we've dealt with it. But again, I just want to welcome you all to here in Signal Hill, and we're happy to host this. So thank you so much.
We have a distinguished panel this morning, to be moderated by, I'd say, the wonderful Steve Preston. I'm a personal fan club here. He's a fellow of the American Institute of Certified Planners. The panel will address how oil and energy extraction have profoundly influenced land use development in Southern California, with a special emphasis on this city. After that, Steve will introduce the panel, and I'd like to, on behalf of the organization, welcome our speakers, Sarah Elkine, Professor of History, San Diego State University, Nancy Quam Whitcomb, Professor of History, Cal State University, Long Beach, and of course, Ken Farson, City Manager. After the panel presentations, we'll break for lunch around 11:45, Ken, something like that. And it'll be out in the padded foyer area out here. And again, thanks to Ken's wonderful staff, we're able to do this program. After lunch, it'll be exciting. Sam Genoway, who's Mr. Brilliance and Energy, will lead us all in discussing this topic and what will happen. We can look at fracking and want to bring all of your thoughts to the table. And again, he's a board member, and there will be an active dialogue. And you know all where the bathrooms are. They're right out there. That was one of my first things to know. But so I'd like to introduce Steve Preston, and may I honor you with the now we have the real Steve Preston come up. Thank you, everybody.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Signal Hill. I'm willing to bet that just about everybody in this room has come to know at least a little tiny bit. We won't even worry about that. You all know who I am, right? All right. I'm willing to bet that each of us knows at least a little about how oil came to be so important in Southern California. It was naturally occurring throughout the region for millennia, most notably in the area now known as La Brea tar pits, where natural history tells us that animals would regularly get captured and trapped by the shining black pools of tar. You may know that Native American peoples used the substance to caulk their boats and canoes and to waterproof their baskets. You might know that early explorers in the region identified the bubbling pools of tar as they crossed the Los Angeles area. You may know that the gente de razón used the tar to caulk the roofs of early adobes. And as the potential value of petroleum became known and was developed, there were a host of efforts to capture that elusive substance in the 1850s and 1860s from ground seepage at Newhall, in 1856 on the Camulos Ranch in Ventura County, and in 1864 in the hills north of the city of Ventura. In 1856 again, when the Los Angeles Pioneer Oil Company, studded with the names of early Los Angeles luminaries like Phineas Banning, Winfield Hancock, John Downey, a name that should be familiar to you, former assistant city manager of Downey, and Benjamin D. Wilson secured the rights to oil on the Rancho San Pascual, where Pasadena and South Pasadena are today located. By 1868, early pioneers attempted to secure the rights to drilling on Rancho La Brea, and the first well was sunk in the San Fernando Valley in 1874. By 1890, before the automobile was actually being introduced here, California ranked third nationally in oil production. But it was still 5 years before the auto arrived in Los Angeles, in November 1892 to be exact. Forgive me. It was still 5 years before the auto arrived, and in 1892 to be exact, everything changed when Edward L. Doheny drilled the city's first well near the intersection of what is today Glendale Boulevard and 2nd Street, launching the boom that defined a generation of growth and change in the urban landscape of Southern California. Now, the auto itself arrived in May 1897 when a four-cylinder horseless carriage was rolled out of a barn on West 5th Street for a trial spin. Just a few years later, according to the historian John D. Weaver, by the time the city's first gas-powered tally-ho rattled past mule teams on Main Street, more than 500 wells were pumping in an area surrounded by Figueroa, First, Union, and Temple. That district formed the nucleus of Los Angeles City oil field, ultimately stretching from Chinatown to East Hollywood. Quote, "This is one of the leading industries of the city, and all legislation bearing on it should be liberal," warned the city's mayor in 1897. Angelenos quickly got caught up in the black gold rush of the 1890s, where the supply was so abundant that, as the Los Angeles News pointed out in 1865, whole tracts of land are found that cannot be traversed on foot in consequence of the thick coating of soft tar, brea, or congealed petroleum. And as the oil rush took off, so did those Angelenos take advantage of the rude crude, often placing wells in the front and backyards of their homes, unaware, or in some cases unconcerned, about the manner in which that oil would forever transform their communities. It spread. Oh, yes, it spread. Doheny opened a Fullerton field in 1896 and one on the Kern River in 1899. Abel Stearns, another famous Los Angeles name, acquired land at Brea, where the Olinda fields opened in 1898. You see, as Harry Carr wrote, fuel had almost stood as an obstacle to industry in Southern California. Coal had to be brought from New Mexico and Utah at prohibitive prices. Oil changed both the life and the psychology of the Pueblo and made San Pedro one of the great harbors of the world. There were downsides: pollution, visual blight, health concerns, and the occasional scandal, evidenced when Chauncey Julian's 1922 investment scheme on land in Santa Fe Springs, a swindle that robbed hundreds of their investment dollars, landed his contemporaries in jail, and caused Julian himself to commit suicide. By 1936, when Harry Carr wrote his book on Los Angeles, he described the despoiled landscapes wrought by oil extraction at Huntington Beach, Long Beach, and Sausal Redondo, Manhattan Beach, and Playa del Rey. But by then, oil had become an economic titan. The story of oil and its impact on the region's physical appearance is deeper and far more nuanced than this simple chronology would allow. Today's speakers will take you on a tour of oil and how it has shaped the region's destiny, from Signal Hill, where Shell Oil leased 240 acres in 1920 and unleashed the explosive power of oil, through the decades that followed. We'll explore the broadest historical trends presented by Ken Farsing, the unique growth and the evolution of this particular suburb. Then we'll broaden our focus and explore the manner in which land use and regulatory tools have been used to control extraction, property rights, discuss the impact of World War II on oil in Southern California, and the evolving perceptions of oil and oil companies. And finally, we'll take on oil from the perspectives of workers, residents, government agencies, and the culture at large. We have a great morning planned, so let's get started by introducing you formally to our speakers. Our first speaker today will be Sarah Elkind. Sarah is, will be Ken Farsing. I've got these in the wrong order, my apologies. Will be Ken Farsing. Ken has more than 33 years experience in community development, redevelopment, economic development, and city manager in 5 Southern California communities. He's been the city manager of Signal Hill since 1996, was previously the city manager of South Pasadena from 1991 to 96, and the assistant city manager in Downey from 1988 to 1991. He worked in various planning and redevelopment capacities in the city of Laverne, including as the community development director there from 1981 to 1988. His master's degree is in urban planning from the University of Southern California, and he was a student intern in Santa Fe Springs, one of the cities that boasts a proud legacy of oil. He received his BA in history from UC Berkeley in 1976. Ken is active in regional issues and organizations, including the City Manager Steering Committee for the Gateway Cities Council of Governments, and was a member of the Water Quality Task Force of the League of California Cities. He is perhaps best known among city managers for his expertise in stormwater, a subject in which Ken pulled out a major victory this week at the Regional Water Quality Board. Yeah, let's hear a round of applause for Ken. I will introduce each of our other speakers as they come up, but for now we're going to take a tour of one particular Southern California city, Signal Hill, to introduce the topic to you. It's my pleasure to welcome Ken Farsing.
Thank you, Steve. It's always great to have your friends introduce you, isn't it? You get the idea this is a small club here? Signal Hill's history can be simplified by anchoring yourself on June 23rd, 1921, the day that Discovery Well, or we call it Alamedas Number 1, erupted in a big way. The discovery of oil dramatically impacted Signal Hill's history. However, as Steve's pointed out, history is more nuanced and complex. We have chapters similar to other Southern California communities of Native Americans, the Spanish, the Californios. We have a chapter of early developers. We have the influence of the Pacific Red Car. We have oil's discovery, our push to incorporate it as a city, the early struggles to regulate oil and address its impact. And then there's the reclaiming of Signal Hill, and this chapter is really being written even today. We also, in this reclaiming of Signal Hill, have World War II era and a subsidence of the Signal Hill field, the stabilization, the reinvestment in the oil field, the decline of oil production, the re-imaging of our community as a shining city on the hill in the 1960s, the impact of the environmental movement and civic engagement, development moratoriums, land use litigation, and the adoption of a hilltop-specific plan. Now, key in this chapter is the important work of the Signal Hill Redevelopment Agency in a slow and expensive process of reclaiming the community. And I believe the community's come to recognize that with proper management, the oil field can continue to produce for many more decades to come and peacefully coexist with the community. This was not always the case. There we go. The area was originally inhabited by the Tongva tribe, with villages near the existing sites of the Rancho Alamedas Adobe Ranch House and the Los Cerritos Adobe Ranch House. The hill itself was formed by pincer-like forces of the Newport-Inglewood Fault, which actually split the hill on both sides and then lifts it up. Earthquake faults act as huge undersurface dams where oil deposits back up. Signal Hill is located on the dividing line of two great ranchos, Rancho Los Cerritos and Rancho Los Alamitos. Like most of Southern California, this was a great agricultural area from the 1770s to the 1920s. Yankees married into the Californio families. John Temple purchased Rancho Los Cerritos, Rancho the Little Hills in 1834, and Abel Stearns purchased Rancho Los Alamitos, the Rancho of the Cottonwoods, in 1841. In 1866, the Bixby family purchased Rancho Los Cerritos for sheep herding, and the Bixbys partnered with I.W. Hellman to purchase Rancho Los Alamitos in 1978 when Abel Stearns went bankrupt. This is actually a map that was prepared by Abel Stearns, and Signal Hill is right here. The Bixbys sold 4,000 acres to William Wilmore in 1882, who founded Wilmore City, which was renamed to Long Beach after Wilmore went bankrupt only 2 years later in 1884. Newtown struggled since it lacked good rail access, and local wags said it failed because it only allowed 3 saloons. True story. The land survey completed by the Bixbys in 1882 through 1887 subdivided Rancho Los Cerritos into 660-foot by 1,320-foot agricultural parcels. Early photos of Signal Hill from this period depict truck farms and homesteads. A further subdivision, known as the Alamedas Beach Townsite, divided portions of Signal Hill into 20-acre parcels, and Long Beach continued to struggle as an out-of-the-way small community in the 1890s through the 1910s. And Signal Hill was relatively unknown at this period. And Signal Hill this was Pacific Coast Highway here, with Signal Hill at the top of the map. These are just some photos of what Signal Hill would have looked like in the 1890s. It was a treeless hill. This picture's kind of dark, but essentially there's people out on a Sunday stroll. A lot of agriculture in the area. The picture at the bottom is the corner of Spring and Cherry. Now, Kenneth Starr wrote that water made Imperial Los Angeles possible, but it was real estate development, and in only a word he would use that I can't pronounce, and the phantasmagoria of attendant activities that fueled the growth of Southern California. Signal Hill was influenced by the first interurban line construction by Henry Huntington. The Los Angeles to Long Beach line opened on July 4th, 1901. Signal Hill had 4 stops along the line. We're somewhere in there. The interurban line changed the area overnight as Long Beach population grew 610% from 1890 to 1910, from 2,252 residents to 17,809. By 1920, Long Beach had grown to 55,593 residents. Real estate speculation came to Signal Hill 3 years after the Red Car started its operation in Long Beach. In 1904, the town lot subdivision of the Windermere Tract was recorded. The lots are 25 feet wide and 135 feet deep near Atlantic Avenue and Spring Street. By 1905, the hilltop area was being subdivided for grand home sites. In 1910, real estate brochure extolled the virtues of Signal Hill, a central gem of a diamond tiara. Sounds like developers nowadays. The developers financed gravel and oil streets, planted trees. That's the Windermere Tract. They planted trees and shrubs to beautify the area, and novel for its time, they built a water tank and power plant, installed water mains and underground electrical and telephone lines to every lot. From 1905 until 1921, a series of grand residences were constructed on the hilltop. More modest homes were constructed in the lower portions of the hill. These small lots would have dramatic consequences with the discovery of oil and set the community up for destruction of town lot oil drilling. The paradigm shifted on June 23, 1921, when oil was discovered in Signal Hill in the well-known Alamedas No. 1. Geologists from Royal Dutch Shell had suspected that oil lay beneath the hill. They were searching for oil to serve a growing appetite for gasoline from the explosive growth of the automobile in the 1920s. There were already 4.8 million vehicles in the nation by 1917, and there was actually a nationwide gasoline shortage in 1919. It took the discovery of oil in Huntington Beach and Seal Beach to push oil speculators into Signal Hill. Harry McWilliams wrote, "What the gold rush had been to Northern California, the real estate, oil, motion picture boom was to Southern California. The great boom of the 1880s has been spectacular, but it had been limited to land speculation. The boom of the 1920s, on the other hand, was truly a bonanza affair." There she came. There was a cheer from all hands, and the spectators went flying to avoid the oil spray blown by the wind. They let her shoot for a while to avoid the oil spray blown by the wind. The news affected Beach City as if an angel had appeared in a shining cloud and scattered $20 gold pieces over the streets. To tens of thousands of investors, big and little, it meant that hope was turned into glorious certainty. You couldn't keep such news quiet. Upton Sinclair from his book Oil. Alamedas No. 1 at first flowed at 590 barrels per day and settled into 2,400 barrels per day. 10 months after the completion of the Discovery Well, Signal Hill boasted 108 wells, producing 14,000 barrels per day. By 1923, there were 270 wells. New production horizons were discovered at 5,000 feet below the surface. By 1924, the field produced 259,000 barrels of oil per day, 1/3 of the entire production for the state. There are over 2,900 wells at peak production, with 1,719 located in the present-day boundaries of Signal Hill. This is kind of remarkable if you look at it. Security Pacific Bank was passing out maps so people could come to the oil field and purchase shares in oil wells. The rush to pay had its consequences. As the Division of Oil and Gas stated in 1922, there was no thought given to well spacing, areas of drainage, or possible damage to neighboring wells. Also, little attention was paid to well courses resulting in many crooked holes, some of which drifted under neighboring properties. So many trespass lawsuits were filed in Signal Hill that a state law was approved in 1935 that abrogated the lawsuits beginning in March 13 of 1936. The underground city to this day is a jumble of active and inactive pipelines, cables, electrical and gas conduits, contaminated soils, and oil field debris. Oil exploration and development was at first poorly regulated, resulting in damages to Signal Hill's existing residents and farms, rapidly overrunning agricultural uses in the nascent residential neighborhoods. Fires from the field's natural gases were very common in the early years. Shell's second well was a gasser that immediately blew out and caught fire. It took a combination of 17 steam boilers pumping water to bring it under control. Shell's Martin No. 1 required 100 pounds of dynamite to extinguish the fire. The fire engulfed 11 other derricks. These fires and oil well blowouts caused much damage to the surrounding fields and homes. It was reported that one blowout covered a house 200 feet away with mud, oil, and rocks, and ruined trees and left the lawn covered with an 8-inch coat of oil, mud, and rocks. Air quality was a problem with raw gas spewing into the area. Sam Mosier of Signal Oil Company remarked on first seeing Signal Hill in 1921 that the hill appeared to be in a virtual fog 7 miles away due to the steam boilers. He recalled that 5 miles away the noise from the drilling was like thunder. Well casings, sucker rods, the drill pipe clanged on delivery trucks, the venting of gas roared from wells. Mosier recalled oil running in ditches, and where pipelines existed, there were snarls of pipes, conduits for the transmission of gas, sewage, electricity, steam, oil, telephone, telegraph, and water. There were no permits, no inspections. Leaks were common and difficult to locate. Oil field work was hazardous. Workers were killed or injured with gas and oil blowouts. Local newspapers reported regularly on the deaths of oil field workers. Signal Hill became a boom town overnight. Hotels and rooming houses in Long Beach filled to capacity. Some residents turned their homes into boarding houses. Long Beach soon reached a population of 100,000. Andrew Paula's mansion, originally built as a retirement home, was purchased by Shell Oil to house oil field workers. Truck farms and orchards were plowed under in the rush to drill. 1922, 6 years later. This is at the red car right away, looking north. I love this picture. We want a good modern town when the derricks are gone. We contemplate building a city hall, a fire department, a library, schools, and maybe a jail. Don Bowker, Signal Hill's first city attorney, June 6, 1924. The incorporation of Signal Hill as an independent city was prompted by an attempt by Long Beach to annex the area in 1922 to capture property taxes to help finance the construction of the Long Beach Harbor. Instrumental in fighting off Long Beach and the subsequent drive to incorporate in Signal Hill was Jesse Nelson. Jesse wore many hats, including as a reporter for the Long Beach Press and the Long Beach Telegram, where she covered the happenings in Signal Hill. She and her husband, Z.T. Nelson, purchased 17 acres in Signal Hill in 1903. Long Beach moved again to incorporate Signal Hill in 1922. They ran into the wrong person. Jesse's main concern over Long Beach's attempt to annex Signal Hill was that property owners and residents of Signal Hill would not be able to afford the new property taxes. Also, since 1921, she had watched as families were forced to move from Signal Hill due to the chaos created by oil exploration and production, even if their properties did not contain oil. Jesse wanted to bring families back to Signal Hill. She successfully organized and defeated the Long Beach annexation effort and then worked to incorporate Signal Hill as an independent city. Like all boom towns, Signal Hill had its share of public safety problems. This included the assortment of gamblers, bunco men, and prostitutes. Even with the prohibition, liquor was available. Gamblers built shacks with pool tables, slot machines, tobacco counters, and card tables. Contemporary observers noted that there was a carnival atmosphere in Signal Hill. Large circus tents similar to popular revivals were erected for potential investors. Chartered buses from Pershing Square brought prospective investors for free lunch and a get-rich-quick sales pitch. The newly elected city council began the difficult work of taming the intruder known as oil. Elected to the first city council, some of the issues Jesse Nelson tackled were requiring agreements from oil companies to construct pipelines, moving 5 small buildings into the city for the temporary city hall, approving paving projects, providing for police and fire services. She almost single-handedly worked with Long Beach Unified School District to get a new school in Signal Hill. Exhausted by her first year in elected office, she abruptly resigned. She remained in poor health and died on August 29th at the age of 56. The original brick school was destroyed by the Long Beach earthquake in 1933, along with 270 other schools in the region. Signal Hill became the dumping site for tons of brick and debris from the Long Beach earthquake. Ironically, oil production in Signal Hill began to decline noticeably in the war years. The high point for production was reached in 1928, with a production of over 60 million barrels of oil that year. With the start of the Great Depression, oil production in 1930 declined to 36 million barrels. By the start of World War II, production had declined to 14 million barrels. With all of the war and post-war demand for oil, the Wilmington and Signal Hill fields began to subside. Subsidence at the Long Beach Naval Base was over 20 feet. There was less subsidence in Signal Hill, but both the federal and state government stepped in 1950s to stop the collapse. The Subsidence Control Act of 1958 would control subsidence by water flooding the fields. The city adopted its first general plan in 1962, and the plan identified the decline of oil production as a major issue confronting the city. The general plan recognized that Signal Hill had missed out on considerable post-World War II growth in the surrounding communities. In a short 3-year period beginning in 1951, the city of Lakewood added 17,500 tract homes. The May Company opened in 1952 in one of the nation's first master plan commercial centers, the Lakewood Mall. Signal Hill leaders and residents could not have but looked on with envy as the wake of development seemed to pass them by. The 1962 general plan envisioned a city on the hill, styled in the architecture of the Music Center. Multi-story residential, commercial, and office buildings were planned with densities of 80 units per acre. The water flood system stopped in the subsidence and also assisted in improving oil production. The Signal Hill field would reach 1 billion barrels of oil produced in 1985. However, oil production continued to decline. The hilltop area looked like a layer cake in the 1970s and remained this way until the 1990s. In 1974, the city formed the Signal Hill Redevelopment Agency, which included 840 acres of the former oil field. In the formative years, the RDA focused on infrastructure necessary to support the rebirth of the community. During the life of the redevelopment project, the RDA invested over $40 million in assembling parcels as a remedy to town lot drilling of the 1920s. This included the acquisition of hundreds of parcels. One 4-acre parcel had 5,500 ownership interests sold by oil speculators in the 1920s. The 4-acre parcel is now the home of the Signal Hill Police Station. The agency abandoned 96 oil wells at a cost of $7.7 million. Over $10 million was invested in streets, intersections, water, and sewer system upgrades. A total of $98 million was reinvested back into the community by the RDA's dissolution in 2011. The 1986 general plan responded to public criticisms for poor planning and the residents' desire to preserve the small-town character of Signal Hill. There was a land use update in 1989 that further reduced density to 21 units per acre on the hilltop. A massive development proposal forced the city to adopt a moratorium in 1990, and litigation ensued. Eventually, the city adopted the hilltop specific plan, which called for 525 units on the hilltop. Over time, the impacts of the Newport-Inglewood Fault would reduce the plan to 441 units. The master plan development eliminated wells and worked around dozens of remaining wells and oil facilities. Operating wells exist in parks and immediately adjacent to homes. After 94 years of oil production, Signal Hill has learned important lessons. People are amazed to see producing oil wells adjacent to homes, offices, stores, and parks. These pictures from the Atlantic magazine show the fascination as a nationwide audience. The juxtaposition of oil with everyday life can be seen in many areas of Signal Hill. This is a view of Discovery Well Park, which includes several operating oil wells and other oil facilities. The park is immediately adjacent to Alamedas No. 1, where it began. Now, when the well finally goes dry, the land will be added into the park. The state erected a historic monument on the corner of Hill and Temple to memorialize the well where the amazing story of oil in Signal Hill began. The park is widely popular with residents and non-residents alike and includes trails to a very well-used Signal Hill trail system. Now, Signal Hill's historic architectural legacy was destroyed by the rush to drill. The city has been in a slow but deliberate process of reconstructing our past. The city adopted the Crescent Heights Specific Plan, which protects existing homes and allows for the relocation of historic structures from other areas. This home was threatened by development in Long Beach and was moved into Signal Hill and fully restored. Upton Sinclair wrote in Oil, "The news of the discovery of oil in Signal Hill affected Southern California as if an angel had appeared in a shining cloud and scattered $20 gold pieces over the streets." In the 1930s, Ansel Adams was fascinated by the oil field, as we are fascinated today. In a carbon-free future, this angel can finally go to her final resting place. In the meantime, we can marvel at the extremes presented by Signal Hill and the community's quest to reclaim and reconstruct itself. Thank you.
Let us turn then to our second speaker today. It's my pleasure to introduce Sarah S. Elkine. She teaches environmental, California, and public history and runs San Diego State University's Public History Internship Program. She curated Sunshine and Superheroes for the Oakland Museum of California in 2014. The student-designed exhibit used Comic-Con to examine San Diego's tourism industry and American popular culture. In 2011, she published How Local Politics Shape Federal Policy, Business, Power, and the Environment in 20th Century Los Angeles. This study of oil drilling, beaches, air pollution, flooding, and water resources in Southern California explains how business groups secured their influence in Los Angeles politics and how local priorities drove federal policy in the mid-20th century. Her other works include Bay Cities and Water Politics, The Battle for Resources in Boston and Oakland, which won the Abel Woolman Prize for Best Book in Public Works History in 1998, and Public Works and Public Health, Reflections on Urban Politics and Environment from the Public Works Historical Society in 1999. She's currently researching the evolution of national identity in Europe and the United States in 2 comparative studies, one considering American and Spanish water resource development, and another probing cowboys and Vikings in American and Danish popular history and museums. Now, I ask each of our speakers today to give us a pithy statement to get you thinking about their topic. And here was the statement that Sarah gave me. I cannot explain Los Angeles' oil history in a single sentence, but I do think that property rights are important. And know this, you have to drill where the oil is. Ladies and gentlemen, Sarah Elkine.
Statement is every other nuisance industry that occurs near residences or where residences grow around it, you can move. You can move slaughtering houses, you can move breweries, you can move glue factories. You can't move the oil. And that was the problem that Los Angeles faced. And what Ken has showed us is that oil drilling does in fact, or in the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s, did not coexist very well with residential development. So what I want to do is turn us a little bit from Signal Hill to the debates that followed in the 1930s as some of the blush was taken off those $20 gold pieces and people started to contend with what oil development in residential areas meant for property values and property rights and whether it should be allowed at all. The oil development in places like Signal Hill and places where people wanted to keep their residential property going. And I'm now going to start my timer so I don't go too long. The oil development really pitted different aspects of property rights and different landowners against each other. So it pitted the landowners' rights to develop their oil and to exploit the mineral rights underlying their land against other adjacent property owners' rights to either do the same thing in some cases, or more frequently to enjoy their property and use their property without an industrial nightmare next door. And I think you made it pretty clear that the way the oil was drilled in the 20s and 30s, it was an industrial nightmare, that it is not in its current form. So we see conflicts between property owners, conflicts over what the property is for, what land ownership should mean, what a community should be, and conflicts over the relationship between individuals and industries within these areas. So to demonstrate these, I'm actually going to look at Venice. And the reason I'm turning to Venice is the Venice Beach Del Rey oil field, which was discovered in 1929, marked a real turning point in Los Angeles attitudes towards oil drilling in residential areas. And the turning point was from, yeah, let's go get the oil and get rich, it's the Depression, we need the money that we can possibly get from our property, that was Venice, to, wait a minute, this isn't worth it, and the destruction that is brought to other kinds of property values and to the long-term survival of the community, those costs are just way too high. So, oil was discovered in Venice in 1929 after Venice had been annexed to Los Angeles, which meant that Los Angeles' zoning ordinances applied in Venice, sort of theoretically. Zoning prohibited drilling in residential areas, but as everybody who knows anything about zoning knows, it's not that hard in most cases to get a variance. And that's what happened in Venice. So that when the oil was discovered in unincorporated land outside of the Venice and therefore the Los Angeles city limits, and the moment that that oil discovery was made, property owners in Venice ran to city officials and said, we want special permission to drill on our property. So the property rights that dominated in the Venice oil strike were definitely the right to exploit those minerals and lease property, whereas the rights to enjoy property free of next-door nuisances and the stability of property values, which was the purpose of zoning, those second rights were very much sacrificed. The Venice oil field began with the discovery on unincorporated land, and as I said, these property owners petitioned for zoning variances. The city officials commented that oil seemed to be one of the most popular issues with the greatest unanimity of opinion ever experienced in the area. The city council therefore buckled to the political pressure and opened residential Venice for drilling, and I've completely forgotten my slides. So, we've got Long Beach, we've seen some of these. There's a map showing the two locations I'm going to talk about. The Venice oil field is in green, and Ramsey oil is my second case study in blue. Okay, we're just going to let this kind of run for a while here until we catch up with the next map. Okay. So, as happened in Signal Hill, oil transformed Venice with derricks, oil tanks, and pump houses displacing homes. The Los Angeles Times regularly reported on the gushers in Venice, which coated everything for hundreds of yards with a heavy layer of oil. Some companies let their gushers run wild for advertising purposes. There was one that ran for months and months and months with no attempt to control it. Not everyone benefited from this windfall, and this is where the conflict arose. If you were able to lease your land, you could do pretty well, and the sacrifice of your home, because Signal Hill was partially built. Venice was built at the point of this discovery. If you were able to lease your property, you could do pretty well. But if your property was too close to other wells or nobody wanted to lease your property, you were left with property that was suffering all of the consequences with none of the benefits of oil drilling. So essentially, petroleum transformed these Venice lands from home to a fiscal asset where the fate of that fiscal investment, that financial investment, was really out of your hands. Unfortunately for Venice property owners, oil production tapered off very fast in this field, and it tapered off because there were too many oil wells drilled too fast, and the gas pressures that were needed to push the oil out of sand and gravel and into the wells made it possible to pump oil to the surface. Those were depleted really fast because there were just so many different wells. And so production tapered off. It persisted. It didn't disappear entirely, but it tapered off very fast and left a considerable mess for property owners and a massive devaluation of real estate in its wake. And this combination of a very rapid boom followed by a bust with a real big mess left behind came to be known in subsequent discussions of residential area drilling as the destruction of Venice. And in the 1930s and the 1940s, every time there is a well proposed in a residential area or a commercial area of Los Angeles, people talk about, we don't want a repetition of the destruction of Venice. This was the point at which that reassessment of land uses took place. So now we've caught up to our next map. So just 2 years after the Venice boom began, in November of 1931, a small company called Ramsey Oil requested permission to drill a test well in a mixed residential and industrial neighborhood right near the Los Angeles River, below the bluff that Elysian Park sits on. As in Venice, property owners eagerly supported the well, but unlike Venice, almost no one else did. The Los Angeles Times, civic groups, public officials all criticized Ramsey's proposal as adverse to public interests and the welfare of the city. They dismissed proponents as short-sighted and self-interested. They all cited the fiasco at Venice as the key reason for opposing new drilling in residential Los Angeles. So in Venice, 2 years earlier, the oil debate had all been won and framed as an opportunity in terms of land ownership conveying rights to drill for oil and to exploit those mineral rights. And now the people who called oil drilling an invasion of the rights of the abutters won the debate. So these two cases reflected ongoing tensions in American culture between property rights, community, and regulation. A whole lot of the debate sounds like discussions over regulation today. We seem to have a very limited political vocabulary, so we just keep reusing the same terminology over and over again. One of the notable aspects of these cases is that both sides cited property rights as the main justification for their position. Both sides had grounds to argue that either drilling or not drilling was what was best for the community in the long run. So advocates of drilling always argued that their property ownership gave them the right to exploit their mineral rights. They could also have cited the critical importance that oil played in building Los Angeles' industrial sector. Opponents of drilling always argued that their property ownership gave them the right to enjoy their property undamaged by nearby oil wells. The second telling feature of these case studies is the rapid changes in the weight that Los Angeles officials gave community goals of segregating residential and industrial or extractive land uses. So in the early 1930s, energy extraction pushed the limits of Los Angeles' ability to regulate land use. The combination of mess, danger, potential riches, and geographic inflexibility of oil drilling, you have to drill where the oil is, heightened these conflicts and gave energy extraction in Los Angeles its distinctive history. So far, so good. Okay. So now let's move to World War II, and the map here is a whole bunch of the locations of proposed oil wells that were proposed right after Pearl Harbor. And in blue, a couple additional wells that were proposed after peacetime. And here we see the politics of oil change again. And what really, the most important piece of this story in the 1940s is the way the local community clung to the lessons of Venice and wanted to continue to separate industrial uses, meaning oil drilling, from residential land use, because their experience had demonstrated that that boom was too temporary to be counted on and the costs were too great. But they lost the power to determine their own land use regulations. They were overridden by the federal government and the Petroleum Administration for the war. This guy, Frank Knox. He's kind of scary looking. Okay. Zoning and other restrictions on oil drilling stood for the remainder of the 30s. But war mobilization eliminated most of the limits that the local community had agreed upon. This was not simply an attempt to satisfy military and military production needs. I argue this because all of the oil companies argued that it took too much money to drill for oil and to find oil to make any sense to limit their oil production from those wells to just the duration of the war. But they used the war as the justification for the drilling. The other thing is that most of the oil companies acknowledged that if they were drilling in 1943, the wells would not be producing by the time the war ended. The projections, people were already projecting the end of the war by the middle of 1943. So the oil companies really seemed to be using the war as an excuse to change the drilling restrictions that Los Angeles had placed upon them. And residents, for their part, were torn between their desire to maintain their communities as they had and keep their control over decision-making in their communities local, and their determination to do what it took to win the war. And it put them in a very difficult position. The key facts about World War II and oil. The federal government managed the American economy during the war. To secure necessary industrial expertise and cooperation, they integrated business executives into the federal bureaucracy. That included the head of the Petroleum Administration for the war, which was the federal agency that determined where drilling would happen and how much production would happen where. He was a vice president of Standard Oil of California. Okay. This was the first time, World War II, the Great Depression and World War II are the first time that business executives are really brought into the federal bureaucracy. And it changes the relationship between business and government. It opens the way for much greater cooperation and mutual understanding, and much greater business influence on public policy. So in January of 1942, just a month after Pearl Harbor, Shell Oil proposed the first wartime well in a residential neighborhood. To get the approval of this well, in spite of Los Angeles' city regulations, Shell called the well necessary for the war effort. This is not entirely crazy. The Pacific Fleet ran entirely on petroleum and had done so since the 1920s. There was a shortage of aviation fuel, and a lot of the war in the Pacific was aviation, was fought with air battles and airplanes. So fuel was really important. The big problem was that the Petroleum Administration for the war, which we'll hear in a moment, pushed for approval of these oil wells, was actually reducing production from Elk Hills and from other places in California where there were established oil fields that were capable of delivering oil right away. All right, so over 200 residents, so go back to Shell's 1942 proposal, over 200 residents showed up for a public hearing. They all spoke against the well. They wanted to maintain their residential neighborhood as a residential neighborhood. Mayor Fletcher Bowden, whose picture you saw earlier, vetoed the oil well proposal because it threatened the rights of the city and the interests of nearby property owners. And in citing the rights of the city, Mayor Bowden signaled one of his major fears about federal wartime production, that federal war agencies would interfere with city governments. The Secretary of the Navy and other federal officials urged Los Angeles city officials to approve new drilling everywhere in the city of Los Angeles. Property owners near Shell's well declared that they were unimpressed by this appeal, and nevertheless, the city council actually eventually overrode Mayor Bowron and approved wells, provided that the oil companies would do something to make drilling a little less noisy and a little less dangerous. And there were technologies to do that to some extent by now. A lot of oil companies then went, in the aftermath of the decision to allow Shell to drill, a lot of oil companies then submitted new proposals for zoning variances to allow them to drill in places where they had been refused in the past, sometimes refused multiple times. So Bowron was worried and persisted in his opposition to wartime drilling because he was afraid that it would set a dangerous precedent that would make it almost impossible to uphold zoning and plan the city and plan development in the city. He was also very frustrated because he went several times to the oil companies and say, if we let you drill here, will you agree to shut the well off at the point at which peace returns? If this is really a war emergency well, you should be willing to just operate it for the extent of the emergency. And the oil companies always said no. We can't afford to. Yeah. Federal officials rejected the city regulations and the city's arguments on the grounds that the oil was necessary to win the war in the Pacific. The Petroleum Administration for the war responded to Bowron's opposition and Bowron's concerns by pushing to increase the speed at which new oil wells were permitted. The local representative of the Petroleum Administration for the war told the city council that he wanted every field and every pool in the state, including those within the city of Los Angeles, developed as rapidly as possible. So, in 1943, the Los Angeles city government began to approve new oil exploration in residential areas. Bowron continued to oppose it. The long delays, repeated public hearings, and careful manipulation of parliamentary procedure that Bowron used to try and slow this process down cost him and his allies a lot of political capital. And they were then accused of using the oil issue as a political football. One notable quote, "Oil that geologists are certain is underlying the Fox Hills area might be on its way right now to our boys fighting the Japs in the Pacific if it were not for this kind of tactic." Okay. In spite of the pressure, Bowron persisted. He tried to convince the public that the companies were motivated by an expectation of profit rather than actual patriotism. Strong opposition continued in most of the affected. I don't even remember what else is on here. Going. I did actually put this together with some care. Strong opposition to oil wells continued in most affected neighborhoods, but commitment to the war effort tempered that opposition. Some Los Angeles residents remained adamant that sacrificing everything, including their homes and communities, to defeat the Axis was not really worth it. Where others who opposed drilling in residential areas on principle expressed some willingness to accept oil wells if the oil wells would go away when the emergency had passed. My favorite quote from this side, "If the government really needs the oil, I will let them drill in my front yard and turn the proceeds over to the Red Cross if they will agree to stop when the war is over." Or, "The government took my son and can take my oil, but why should I ruin my home to make an oil company richer?" Even those who were willing to accept oil wells as an emergency measure could not countenance wrapping the flag around urban drilling for profit. And as long as the oil companies fought all time limits on oil production from urban wells, these Los Angeles residents just couldn't accept urban drilling. There were a lot of others who did believe that the war justified expanded oil production. In February of 1944, the Los Angeles Times solicited letters from their readers in order to gauge public opinion, and fully 90% of the people who wrote in, counted, favored oil drilling for the war effort, but the outcome might have been tempered by the fact that when they solicited those letters, there was a full-page ad you'd open the newspaper up, and on one side was a please send us your letters about urban oil drilling, and the other was a full-page ad from, I can't remember which oil company, explaining just how important oil was for the war effort. So I'm not sure this was really a scientific poll. The war altered the politics of oil drilling. Technology helped. You can see from this picture, I'm actually on time, that's awesome. You can see from this picture there were efforts to cover derricks, to contain the noise, to shift from diesel pumps to electric pumps. There were more underground pipelines rather than sumps and open tanks. It was better. And that made some of this spreading of oil drilling into residential neighborhoods seem not as completely destructive. But the politics of the emergency really did transform the politics of oil and disempowered local communities to determine what shape they would develop in, and really removed entirely that earlier concern about property rights, be they mineral rights or a right to enjoy your property free of nuisances. Okay, I'm 2 minutes over, I'm sorry. Very quickly. Oil extraction in Los Angeles highlighted early 20th century attitudes about land, resources, money, property rights, regulation, government power, and the public interest. World War II added patriotism to the mix in ways that privileged oil companies and ultimately weakened local planning authority. Both sides of the drilling debates cited patriotism and the war effort. The oil companies, though, clearly had the advantage because federal officials supported oil drilling. The opponents, those who sought to maintain local regulations, could only dispute the oil industry's motives, usually by pointing out that the oil industry called upon Angelenos to sacrifice their homes in the name of patriotism, but refused to sacrifice their own profits by closing their wells down. In this way, patriotism cast local resource policy issues in terms which quelled opposition and undermined industrial regulations. The political realignment that I've just described extended far beyond oil. You can see the same tension over nuisances versus industry versus community in subsequent debates over air pollution. You can see an emphasis on industrial power in the air pollution regulations also, which really crack down on domestic pollution faster and more vigorous and more aggressively than industrial pollution. Industrial pollution was controlled through cooperation rather than sort of fiat. Given the explosive growth of industry, the importance of industrial jobs to the population in World War II era Los Angeles, public policy decisions that benefited industry are not crazy. They're really important. You're not serving the public interest if you shut your industries down and you don't provide jobs, don't allow jobs to exist for your constituents. However, the story of urban drilling also reveals the way in which a national emergency can undermine local legal protections that the community has agreed upon, and can undermine the ability to limit powerful interests, to protect minorities and civil rights, or to shape the environment. And I think those things have been going on they went on during World War II, this happened during the Cold War, and I think they've been happening since 9/11 as well. Thank you.
And so it's now my pleasure to introduce our third speaker of the morning to you. Dr. Nancy Quam Wickham is a professor of history and was chair of the Department of History at Long Beach State from 2005 to 2015. You're still the chair, correct? No. And are you feeling good about that? You ran away. Her research interests include environmental, gender, and social history, oral history, history pedagogy, and assessment practices in higher education. Prior to becoming department chair, she was editor of the History Teacher Journal. She's a participant in the American Historical Association's tuning project and has presented her work on tuning in history at many professional meetings. In October of 2014, Dr. Quam Wickham was one of 12 scholars nationwide to be named as a faculty coach for the Degree Qualifications Profile Project, a collaborative initiative endorsed by the American Association of Colleges and Universities with origins in the Bologna process. Professor Quam Wickham is particularly interested in the impact of natural resource development and exploitation in the American West, including the Pacific Basin. She's currently working on a study of whaling in the Pacific Ocean from the late 1700s to the mid-1900s. She's also finishing an article on transforming the lower division U.S. History Survey course by embracing active learning. She is also involved, there are some links available, which I think we've got on our bios, where you can learn more about her U.S. History Lab program, in which students produce curriculum materials for at-risk high school history students in the Long Beach Unified School District. In her spare time, of which she has absolutely none, she enjoys traveling, sea kayaking, hiking, and backpacking in the Sierras. Now, I asked each of our speakers to give us a little bit of a pithy statement just to get the discussion going, and so this is what Nancy gave us. 70 feet down, below a manifold of 4 30-inch pipes, deep in the bilge of an Arco tanker, 90-degree ocean water heating the whole, 98-degree atmosphere off the coast of Panama, I found myself mopping up waste oil, sweating profusely at midnight. Is it a wonder I became an oil historian? Dr. Quam Wickham is going to talk a little bit about workers' perspectives, residents' perspectives, governmental perspectives, and the culture. It's a pleasure to introduce Dr. Quam Wickham.
Okay, you'll have to forgive me for a moment. I'm going to set my timer. And I think it's going. Okay. I want to start, and thank you for a wonderful introduction. I want to start these comments with a very personal observation. Like most of us here, I live in the LA Basin, although I'm not entirely a voluntary resident. I'm an exile from Northern California. But I live here in LA, in the LA region, a region that owes its economic, social, and cultural prominence and its relatively high standard of living, in large part, historically speaking, to cheap oil. As such, we are part of, in the words of one early oil booster, an oleaginous civilization. And I'm going to spare you from most of the really bad quotes that I've come up with in my research. Oh, I've got some, don't worry. Okay, beginning in the late 19th century and quickening pace in the first 3 decades of the 20th century, oil production here occurred in an urbanizing region. And I think that's one of the things that really makes us distinctive, the LA case. By 1925, no other major oil-producing region in the world was so similarly urban as was the case here in Southern California. Oklahoma City's development was largely a little bit later than Los Angeles, as it occurred in the 30s and the 40s. Oil production propelled Los Angeles into full participation in a global economy. In the 1920s, about 25% of the world's oil was produced here. They used to call us a Saudi Arabia of oil, of the 1920s, rather. That was much later, obviously. The ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach were reorganized, largely bureaucratically, and expanded exponentially to handle oil exports. The Slauson Steel Corridor, or Steel Town as it was known to its residents, was almost entirely devoted to the production of oil field and refinery machinery. And labor demands in the fields, refineries, and corporate offices enticed tens of thousands of ambitious men and women to migrate here. At the same time, the urban setting brought to the public's view some of oil's most unsettling characteristics. I want to provide a swift introduction here, some of which you've already received, to oil development in Southern California, illustrating the ways in which this resource dominated development in this urban space. The Los Angeles basin became the center of California's, and for a time, the world's oil production, beginning in the years right around World War I. Yes, Doheny came earlier for the most part, but the big fields, the really sort of big fields, weren't discovered until about World War I. First with Montebello. First with Montebello in 1917, Richfield in 1919, Newport Beach and Huntington Beach down here in 1920, Long Beach, otherwise known as Signal Hill, in 1921, Santa Fe Springs and Torrance. I did it again. Okay, Santa Fe Springs up here, and then over here, Torrance Field in 1922, Dominguez in 1923, Inglewood, 1924, which is right up here. You can see there are essentially the geography of this, or geology of this is, there are two essentially parallel lines of oil deposits. Seal Beach in 1926, and the granddaddy of them all, Wilmington, here in the 1930s. And I'll talk a little bit about Wilmington and how it came about. In the summer of 1923, the region's three most important fields, Huntington Beach, Long Beach, and Santa Fe Springs, accounted for nearly 80% of the state's record-setting production of 872,000 barrels a day. That's a daily production that is as much or more than was spilled in the Exxon Valdez in 1989, that record. So it was a lot of oil coming out of here. Local residents welcomed oil and its attendant industrial development, at least initially. Communities that had once prized themselves on for being rural towns for home folks. This is Signal Hill. Doesn't quite look like a rural town. Now rushed to get a piece of the oil and industrial action, in the process casting off any claims to the rustic ideal of the archetypal Los Angeles suburb that we've grown to know. Locals embraced this instant transformation of their towns. This is very common for Santa Fe Springs, which had a lot of gas covering the oil pools. But local residents rushed to get a piece of the oil industrial action, casting off any claims to the rustic ideal. They embraced this instant transformation of their towns. As one newspaper reporter almost breathlessly described, a veritable industrial symphony, and I quote here, "Thousands of oil workers are toiling relentlessly day and night in the local fields. The concert of sounds made by the ponderous machinery, gushing steam from exhaust pipes, and the steady drive of powerful engines tells the story of immense doings. It is becoming more wonderful as the carpenters, who are the vanguards, put up a derrick almost in a day, to be followed by giant truckloads of machinery and oil rigging apparatus. Thus the field grows with magnetic power. With every well a success, where will the end be?" End quote. However successful oil development became, it brought with it real challenges: increased costs of living and unplanned sprawl, environmental degradation, and patchwork responses to resolve these problems. One consequence of such rapid industrialization was unplanned sprawl, the haphazard ways in which workers and their families found living accommodations near their work sites. In the 1920s, which this is 1940s, but in the 1920s, Huntington Beach was reportedly filled with tents. In the tent city, They had a regular tent city, kind of like a trailer park, I guess. Tents were filled churchyards, old campgrounds, and on the beach. Workers lived in them. Blocks upon blocks of shacks were built of nothing more than cardboard. These makeshift communities were called rag rows, or rag towns. Other rag towns sprouted around oil districts in Long Beach and Signal Hill, Wilmington, Carson, Norwalk, La Habra, and Inglewood. Elsewhere in the oil region, patterns of residence in company-provided housing on oil leases can best be described as scattered settlements comprised of loosely linked villages spread across a wide expanse of oil fields. Each village was the camp of one company, and there are a lot of these oil camps throughout Southern California. Despite the dispersed nature of settlement, people derived their identities from their residence in a particular oil community, because in the words of one resident of Olinda, we were mostly close together. All the people worked right there in the oil fields. So these are people that really saw their identity as oil workers or oil families. And then, of course, in El Segundo, we have a valuable prototype of a planned community, a company town organized around the refinery there. But that was unusual for refineries. Work demands structured life in these communities. Oil field work had long been an endeavor of skilled workers, though this was changing in the 1920s with the advent of new drilling technologies. The average man would not work in the oil fields, remembered one worker, because it was so treacherous, so dangerous. Working conditions were indeed brutal, and there were some horrific accidents that I'm going to describe here. I've saved the best for last. In the early 1920s, 1 in 4 workers was hurt or killed on the job in Southern California. Local newspapers reported on oil field accidents in graphic detail. A worker was caught in the rotary machinery and whirled to his death, his arms torn off in the process. Another was crushed to death in a fall from the top of a derrick as his co-workers watched in horror. A split cable could easily cut a man in half. Steam lines routinely broke and burned men, essentially cooking them in the process. One man fell 70 feet from a derrick, shearing off his feet as he hit the ground like this, driving his tibia into the earth up to his knees. Others were incinerated in blowouts and fires. Some became overcome by fumes, fell into tanks, and drowned. And this is important to understand. A typical oil tank in the 1920s either didn't have a roof at all or was covered with a paper roof. As one Signal Hill poet mourned, with every worker's death, it's only a worker gone. To add to these conditions, oil field children routinely played in the oil fields. By the early 1930s, many oil companies in the LA area had to hire private guards to keep oil field kids off of oil equipment and out of oil sumps, especially off the walking beams that served as the equivalent of mechanical horses to oil field kids. The large oil sump that was once known as the duck pond in Central Park and Huntington Beach was particularly hazardous, as many youngsters drowned there. And in fact, boys used to have rowboat races across it. It was filled with waste crude. Responses to the challenges of oil development were, as I noted, largely haphazard. Workers and their union, the forerunner of the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union, now a division of steelworkers, were often at the forefront, demanding safer working conditions and better wages. Even in the 1920s, when unionism was at its low in this region, oil workers had the assistance of the federal government in the form of Federal Oil Board referees who facilitated workmen's committees, were essentially shop committees, that had the power to interrupt operations in refineries and fields. The oil board members referees also supervised annual wage and conditions conferences at Shell, here in Signal Hill in particular, where the annual contract was negotiated collaboratively between business and labor, overseen by the federal government, and served as the unofficial standard for all operations and wage rates in Southern California. Workers also organized referenda to slow oil production, arguing that unrestrained development had negative environmental consequences in Huntington Beach, Redondo Beach, and elsewhere. Other regulatory efforts were similarly diffuse. In the 1920s, the ecological consequences of unrestrained oil production were mind-boggling. Wells exploded in fireballs, hastily constructed pipelines burst, sending rivers of oil down to the sea. Drilling rigs contaminated groundwater supplies. Companies routinely used natural sinks as waste oil sumps. And this is one here. This is actually a natural sump. Natural gas was an undesirable byproduct of crude production, so in many fields, gas was simply allowed to surge into the air. At one point, the harbor in 1923 was reportedly covered in between 4 and 6 inches of crude oil. Local city councils reacted by attempting to limit well drilling or to ban operations altogether. Some communities, like Signal Hill, incorporated in order to pass their own regulatory initiatives. Another effort was by the California Fish and Game, which was perhaps the most successful government agency in improving environmental quality in this region during the 1920s. The commission's wardens filed hundreds of warrants against corporations for wanton dumping of oil refuse in local waterways, using the 1924 Harbor Act as the basis. Their concern was with water quality in navigable waterways. If you don't know it, that's kind of a navigable waterway. Many of the most contested cases were adjudicated in local courts. The point here is that regulation of the industry was piecemeal and haphazard, largely local in its origins, and thus, with the exception of labor, largely uncoordinated by greater administrative entities like the federal government. Even prior to Frank Knox and the Petroleum Administration for War, though in the 1930s, the federal government instituted an oil referee system where government referees attempted to prevent catastrophic price collapse during the Great Depression by instituting a voluntary system of limiting production among competitors. And it wasn't always the most successful. And in fact, Ed Pauley was notorious for not taking the advice of the oil referee, and he would undercut and sell his oil on the black market for as little as $0.25 a barrel. It was not until the 1970s that the federal government became involved more systematically in the regulation of the industry. The story of the Wilmington oil field illustrates the ways in which unrestrained oil development led to environmental catastrophe, and it also speaks to the lengths to which oil companies would go to protect their own interests. Although first discovered in 1932, the discovery company, Ranger Petroleum, mistakenly believed that their well was simply tapping into an extension of the Torrance field. Enter immigrant longshoreman Chuchu Salcido, who one fateful afternoon in April 1935 discovered oil, or more properly, the light end product known as casing head gas, overlying the dome of a fantastically rich oil field, while digging a cesspool on his homestead. He had just taken out Homestead Act papers in Wilmington. Within weeks, Salcido's find captured the public imagination. What ensued was probably the strangest example of oil field development in the history of the United States. The field was developed solely by what were called then the backyard operators, who dug wells by hand using shovels and spades and cased their wells with the shells of salvaged water heaters, in this case, in order to prevent the sandy soils of Wilmington from caving in. They pumped their wells by hand using old water pumps at low tide. And you can see here, there's a man there, there's a man there, there's a man, there are men out there on many of those wells. They don't look like Signal Hills wells. This makeshift oil field did not last long, though, as it was clear that Wilmington was a very rich field. Within months, prominent oil men, among them the Pattons, the Huntingtons, and others, had convinced the city of Los Angeles to ban the backyard oil operators because, in their view, they presented great environmental risks. This is ironic, to say the least. By 1958, so the backyard oil operators period only lasted about 7 or 8 months. By 1936, they were pretty much run out of business because they required a fire insurance bond of $500 on every single one of those rigs. By 1958, the Wilmington oil field was the second most productive field in the nation, second only to the famous East Texas field. It has produced over 2.5 billion barrels of oil and is still producing today. Once the majors, as they're called, began production in Wilmington, the accompanying environmental problems, pollution, fires, release of toxic gases occurred. But more importantly, the geological substructure was such that as oil was removed from the ground, the surface land sunk, a phenomenon known as subsidence. By the late 1940s, so much oil had been taken out of the ground that Wilmington became known as that sinking city, where subsidence was as great as 42 feet, fracturing water lines, roadways, railroad tracks, and requiring the city to rebuild the harbor water treatment plant twice before it ever even opened. The Ford plant, in fact, largely shut down because of subsidence. They had to rebuild it right after World War II, and by the late 1950s, when they shut the Ford plant down, the managers on the second floor, because the building was so much heavier and sank quicker than the parking lot, the managers on the second floor could look out the window at their cars in the parking lot. Elevator shafts bent in the city of Long Beach, and subsidence led to the decline of Long Beach's urban core. It's implicated in fact, subsidence is implicated in the move outward, the suburbanization of places like Lakewood, the development of places like Lakewood. Subsidence also had some benefits. It deepened the channel south of Long Beach City Center, making it possible for the Queen Mary to be docked here. Subsidence and its resolution, that's a dog in Wilmington trying to figure out how to hit the fire hydrant. Anyway, so resolving the problem. So the problem was to inject water into the fields, into the pools, oil pools, as the oil was pumped out, and that sort of allowed the earth to float on top of water and oil. So it resulted, as noted earlier, there was a 1958 Subsidence Control Act that made mandatory water injection, but this was a technology that was developing very early, even in the 1940s. But subsidence has resulted in other problems, and it's been implicated in the Baldwin Hills dam break in 1963. So my final point today concerns how American culture, seeing all these disasters, right? So how do we live with oil? So how has American culture sanitized oil's image? or in the words of historian Bob Johnson, tamp down any concerns Americans may have about living in a fossil-fueled world. The earliest commenters about oil in LA wrote about how the sluggish, and this is a quote, the sluggish flood of nature's blood conquered all the peace of earth and God Almighty. Boyhood dreams of love and fame as sentiment must bow to progress. Eden is now but a name. Frequently uneasy with the pace of landscape transfiguration and social transformation, oil's detractors produced a remarkable body of literature that gave voice to contemporary concerns over claims of oil's links to human progress, employing Dante-like visions of infernos complete with belching satans and demons unprisoned. Oil's detractors often used oil's capacity for disasters as a device to both question and protest the often violent and all too rapid regional transformation occurring around them. Themes of paradise lost and Eden betrayed signaled popular discontent with oil as its development scarred the countryside and changed rural communities into urbanized centers. But another more prominent cultural viewpoint emerged that saw oil as essential to American progress. You can see sort of an early representation of this here. That where you have, flowers right there. These are postcards, and there are hundreds and hundreds of these postcards. I actually collect industrial disaster postcards. But this is one of them. This is not nearly, I've got some really great ones, but they're not about LA. But you can see, right here, the little flowers. What's really interesting to me is you see these very clean streets, not a drop of oil on the roofs of these houses or these shacks. The air is clean. That little pink stuff is actually a postal stamp leading through the back. But you can see these kinds of images that develop that, led us to consider how these two strains of popular culture can coexist in the first decades of this century. These cultural productions delineate lines of power, illuminating the cultural politics of a war between capital and nature, profit and human society. The Oil is Progress group eventually won out as they gained control of the mechanisms of mass culture, like the postcard industry. People wrote then, they didn't text. Contemporary observers often wrote of LA's early 20th century fields as comprised of forests of derricks, which is, I think, a very common but strange allusion to nature. Postcards of the time depict derricks on the beach. Again, and I should say, what looks like a little bit of oil, spilled oil, was actually a speck of dirt on my scanner. But people who talk about Huntington Beach and Santa Barbara say that the beach didn't really look like this, right? Postcards of the time depict derricks on the beach where the sands are clean, the water's clean, the air is clean, all in stark contrast to contemporary accounts of the fields. Richfield built its famous black crude and gold Art Deco headquarters building in downtown LA in an ostentatious display of wealth, slick but clean, gaudy but dazzling at the same time. So these kinds of architectural and imagery things I think are very important. This is a celebratory vignette from, these are, I don't know, does anybody collect stock certificates as well here? There's a very vibrant market in the collection of old stock certificates, especially oil stock certificates. Because you can see, this is actually a better one, where you see in the oil field, you've got this, woman. The woman often represents progress, holding the earth in her hand in an oil field. This doesn't even scratch the surface of weird. The stuff I look at. Okay.
Is this slide baked into your gender politics?
Oh yeah. And in the 1930s, and one of my favorites is in the 1930s, drawing actually upon 1920s U.S. Geological Survey literature, corporate marketing geniuses created a narrative of dinosaurs and their alleged relationship to oil. That crude was the natural byproduct of decaying organic material, as if Sinclair's Brontosaurus had somehow willingly sacrificed his life for ours. Surely a perversion of the ultimate sacrifice. We hide, we can go on and on and on, but we hide our rigs behind these highly decorated facades. And we have the oil islands. I can't tell you how many times, I'm sure everybody else here has had you walk along the bluff and some tourist says, especially at Christmas time or, when the oil islands are all lighted up, how do you get out there? Isn't there a circus out there? So, even today we memorialize some of LA's most successful corporate icons associated with oil, with, for instance, the Doheny Library, the Getty Museum, and the Poly Pavilion. Even in a day when we have deep concerns about living in a fossil fuel paradise, planning, and I think this is important, planning professions' mandate is how we can learn to better live with oil. Thank you.
Have these not been 3 wonderful presentations today? In a couple of moments, we're going to release you to lunch, but we wanted to ask our panelists a couple of questions before we do the lunch call here. And these questions try and tie some of what you've heard from a historical perspective to the work that urban and regional planners do. So I'm going to pose the first question. Any of our panelists who wish to take a shot at it can answer this. California planning has often had a unique perspective that differs from the way that planning is approached in other states, whether it be the regulatory regime imposed by CEQA, the impacts of the State Coastal Act, and local coastal plans, to name just a few. How does the experience in the LA region compare or contrast with the experiences of oil-producing communities in other parts of the country? Would one of our speakers like to take a shot at that? The one planner at the table says, "Not me."
The most important thing I think to say is the coexistence of urban communities and oil is the thing that is uniquely challenging for oil and planning and zoning. That there are industrial and zoning challenges and regulatory challenges everywhere, but you don't usually have an extractive mineral boom bust industry right in a city, under a city. That's the difference.
And I'll do a follow-up, and since you're unfortunate enough to be holding the microphone. So California law requires that you address some of these issues in a community's general plan, the long-range comprehensive guide to a city's development. But it doesn't look like a lot of cities really take the time to use that conservation element where you talk about those underground resources and figure out how you reconcile all these competing interests. Any of you have a thought to share on that?
I have this is not as a scholar, this is as an observer, and my observations about planning is that it doesn't have enough teeth. You come up with master plans, and San Diego's master plan in the 1950s designated the entire river valley, where Interstate 8 and housing and shopping malls now is, as open space and agricultural preserve, and that was overridden in 5 years after the plan was finished.
Yeah, we do a little better today than in the 50s, but there's still room to go, Ken.
I think one of the...
Yes.
There we go. I think one of the things here in Signal Hill that we focused in on is the impact of oil on water quality and water supply. And a couple of years ago, we went out and actually hired a professional firm to take a look at the interaction between our oil field and where we get our groundwater. And for years, Signal Hill basically had its wells located in the city of Long Beach. They're several miles north of here, and I think that's because of the influence of the oil field and the concern that basically drinking water could be contaminated. But as we've grown more sophisticated, kind of understand how the oil field operates and how the groundwater operates in our drinking aquifers, we actually have a well here in the city of Signal Hill that's basically a drinking water well, and it's on top of the oil field. So it's a very interesting, this discussion that's going on in terms of implications of water quality in oil fields. When you really examine it and bring the scientists in, the water quality folks to take a look at it, you just have to be careful with that. And it's an area of conservation that, to me, basically, oil's a valuable resource. Drinking water is a valuable resource as well. So how do you basically reconcile what could be conflicts between those two? So I don't think cities do a particularly good job of doing that. In my experience, they've kind of ignored that issue. And I think more cities should be looking at the implications of, cities with oil should really be looking at the implications of the impacts on water quality and water supply.
Thank you again, Nancy.
I'm not a city planner. I don't even really consider myself an urban historian, although I do work, at least the oil work was on Southern California. But I also did a lot of stuff, a lot of research on oil outside of Southern California proper. I think there's a couple of things here that are really important that haven't been explored very well, except for maybe by me. Well, and I haven't always published. I haven't always published it, which is why it's not out there. But one of the things I think is the importance of the federal government in managing labor relations within the oil industry in California from 1916, 1917, all the way through World War II. They focused on Shell because Shell was the company that was most favorable towards organized labor. But really, this, as I said, the standards that Shell agreed to every year, and there were, all the way through these years, there were these long, protracted, 2-week-long negotiated bargaining sessions, essentially. What that did is it allowed the oil workers union to institutionalize itself. And as production shifted, or as the oil industry shifted from production to refining, it created essentially an organized workforce in oil refineries that, covered by union contracts, that created jobs and a stable workforce out of what had previously been a very transient workforce, right? So you have sort of an institutionalization of oil labor and oil workers that is really very important to this region. I mean, look at the opening scenes of Blade Runner, right? They fly through the refineries over, the Carson refineries. So I think that's one thing that really sort of I need to get going on and publish that stuff. Be quiet. She said, yes, I do. I was 10 years a chair, and there were other complications, and I didn't get to this. But I think the other thing is to look, at least in California, we had a stronger, because of the progressive era reforms, we had a stronger state regulatory mechanism than most other states had, right? So our State Fish and Game Commission had these agents that would go and they would just write these tickets wholesale and issue arrest warrants for corporate officers. This is pretty funny, actually. You know, you got a game warden coming in and busting, you know, coming onto a rig and, you know, a site and saying, well, who's the boss here? And they'll say, oh, me. Well, come on, you're going to jail, right? In the 1920s, you know, and most other states didn't have as well developed a set of state agencies and government to try to manage some of the, you know, the negative impacts of oil.
One last question, if I might. Some California communities, in an effort to encourage economic growth, have largely turned their back on the physical legacy that oil left behind. If you compare Signal Hill, for example, which we heard about today, with Brea in Orange County, Brea essentially razed its entire oil-era business district in order to create a sanitized suburban downtown. What are the distinctive traits between those communities that have chosen to embrace their oil history and those that have chosen not to? I worked hard on that question. You know, it's nice. I get to ask the questions, but I don't actually have to answer them. Any thoughts?
You know, I've worked both in Santa Fe Springs and Signal Hill. They kind of bookend my careers. And, you know, Santa Fe Springs and Signal Hill have a lot of similarities. And the oil fields are a bit different. I'm not sure about the production. I think Steve is in the audience there. He has a little better handle on it since he works there. So in terms of kind of the differences between those communities is that essentially we have oil with a town lot drilling phenomena, and the oil's integrated into our community and in a way has to be, because the field, from what we can tell, is going to be here for probably another century or more. There's just quite a bit of oil down there, and technology keeps changing to where more resources are recoverable. I think Santa Fe Springs, Steve could talk about it, but perhaps there, with the activities of their redevelopment agency, they were able to go in and really purchase large tracts of land. And I remember working there when just acres and acres of pipe were being pulled out, and wells were being abandoned, and they were able to reinvent themselves to be more of an industrial community, you know, with everything that they have going for them, where we really didn't have that opportunity to do it. So for us, you know, we had to learn to really work around oil because we just didn't have the resources like the Santa Fe Springs to completely reinvent ourselves. So it's a little bit of perspective, at least from two communities.
Thank you, Nancy.
Well, I think the other sort of instructive example is Huntington Beach, right? Surf City. They completely rebranded themselves. And Huntington Beach had for a long time it was a standard town, Standard Oil town, but they had a very uneasy relationship with oil, given the number of referenda that had come before the city, even in the 1920s, about trying to stop oil development. So, you know, there's still oil in Huntington. There's still oil being produced in Huntington Beach. But especially with post-war growth, oil was not the major employer in Huntington Beach after the war. Aerospace was, right? So what's better for, you know, the children of aerospace workers than to go to the beach and blow off their steam there, rather than row around in little boats and have races on oil sumps.
Sarah gets the last word.
I wonder if we shouldn't also think about this question in broader terms, in terms of the deindustrialization of American cities. That this is not just what is the legacy of this oil community that has retained an oil industry versus Santa Fe Springs, or Brea, which has ignored that past. It's what do you do when the big employer leaves town? And are you able to maintain an industrial presence and employment? Are you able to come up with a better, with a new economic sector, or are you Detroit? Right? And Huntington Beach has branded itself in part as a clean city that's a clean beach town, which is a tourism city, but they clearly have enough employment that they're not just relying on tourism, because tourism always sounds like it's gonna work better than it does. But my favorite place to park in Huntington Beach is next to one of those, like the smallest grasshopper I've ever seen.
Have you named it?
No, but I sort of drive around, I'm like, oh yeah, there's that little space over there that nobody thinks of. So, I mean, I know that it's still there, but this is a much bigger question about what do you do as a city, how do you cope with a changing economy?
And when we come back after lunch, all of you will have an opportunity to help participate in that discussion when Sam Genoway takes the floor and helps facilitate a discussion which all of you will get a chance to ask and answer your questions.